Irene and Walter Beckman had been married for 47 years, the kind of couple neighbors called forever. But behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and smiling Christmas cards, a horrifying truth lay buried. Literally. For decades, Irene mourned the mysterious disappearance of their teenage son, Joel, never suspecting the quiet man beside her was hiding the darkest secret imaginable. It wasn't until the FBI arrived with a warrant that she discovered the horrifying truth. Joel had never run away. He had never even left the house. For nearly 5 decades, Walter and Irene Beckman lived what most would call an ordinary, peaceful life. They met in the spring of 1973, just after Irene graduated from a community college with a degree in office administration. Walter, already a few years into his career as a mail carrier, was quiet, methodical, and deeply rooted in traditional values. He believed in structure, hard work, and loyalty, traits he brought into their marriage, which began in a modest church ceremony that summer. Over the years, they became one of those couples everyone in the neighborhood recognized. The Beckmans from Oak Ridge Drive. They were seen every Sunday at church, hand in hand at the supermarket, and hosting annual 4th of July picnics that drew families from across town. They raised 2 children, Anna, born in 1976, and Joel, born in 1972. From the outside, the family was what small-town ideals were built upon. Walter would rise before dawn to start his mail route, rain or shine, and Irene spent years working as a school secretary before retiring early to take care of her aging mother. They attended PTA meetings, went on family camping trips, and enrolled their kids in piano lessons, soccer, and community volunteering. There were countless photo albums filled with birthdays, vacations to Lake Erie, and school plays. People described them as the kind of family that made you believe in good old-fashioned values. No scandals, no drama, nothing unusual. But beneath the picture-perfect surface, not everything was as ideal as it seemed. Especially with Joel. He had always been the quieter of the 2 siblings, introspective and artistic, with a love for sketching and nature. While Anna thrived in school and social activities, Joel often kept to himself. By his teenage years, he became more withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room, or wandering nearby trails with a camera he'd saved up to buy. Irene often chalked it up to just being a boy, but Walter didn't see it that way. He believed discipline made boys into men, and he didn't tolerate what he considered weakness or laziness. Joel's increasing disinterest in school and reluctance to follow his father's strict rules led to tension that grew more intense with time. The summer of 1989 was supposed to be a turning point for Joel. He had just finished his junior year of high school, but his grades were poor and he hadn't committed to any plans for the future. Walter pushed him to consider the military or a trade, but Joel didn't want either. Their arguments became louder, more frequent, and more bitter. Irene did her best to mediate, but she was often caught in the middle, trying to soothe Joel's frustration while not provoking Walter's temper. One day in early June, neighbors overheard shouting coming from inside the house. It wasn't unusual by then, but the volume and the duration made a few of them pause. Still, no one thought to call the police. In those days, people minded their business. Then, on the night of June 11th, Joel was gone. Irene awoke that morning to an empty bed in her son's room and a note on the kitchen table, written in Joel's unmistakable hand. It simply said, "I need to get away for a while. Please, don't look for me." Her hands trembled as she read it. Walter, standing behind her, nodded grimly and said, "He's run off. It was just a matter of time." The police were called. They came, took a report, made some calls. But without signs of foul play, it was quickly categorized as a teenage runaway. A few flyers went up and his school friends were interviewed. No one knew where he'd gone. No one saw him leave. The weeks turned into months, and Joel never came back. There were no phone calls, no letters, no sightings. Walter insisted they accept it and move forward. Irene tried. She really did, but every night she turned on the porch light, just in case. Every birthday she baked a small cake, placed it on the table, and stared at it in silence. By the time the 90s rolled in, Joel's absence became a painful shadow in their lives, present but unspoken. Walter never brought it up. Irene never let it go. To the world, they were still the Beckmans, still strong, still smiling. But in the quiet corners of their home, a silence lingered too loud to ignore. In 2023, decades after Joel Beckman's disappearance had faded from public memory, the case landed unexpectedly on the desk of FBI Special Agent Mara Sloan. She worked in a unit newly dedicated to revisiting cold cases, specifically those involving long-term missing minors. Joel's file had been dormant for years, collecting dust in a digital archive, until an intern tasked with reclassifying old cases flagged it. It seemed strange. No contact in over 30 years, no confirmed sightings, no paper trail, no DNA matches in any database. Just a 17-year-old boy who had supposedly walked away and vanished completely. What first drew Agent Sloan's attention was how little detail there was in the original report. Joel's disappearance had been accepted as a runaway case with surprising ease. There were no signs of follow-up beyond a few weeks. No formal missing persons bulletin was ever widely circulated. No family interviews were documented in depth. Just a brief note, a handful of neighborhood statements, and a lack of physical evidence. She noticed one subtle yet chilling detail. Walter Beckman's name was absent from the initial report as the complainant. It had been Irene who called the police and insisted her son would never leave without saying goodbye. Walter, according to an old officer's memo, had been reluctant to cooperate, brushing off concerns and minimizing his son's state of mind. Agent Sloan began digging. She retrieved microfiche records from the local Greenville Police Department, reviewed Joel's school records, and found that the boy had been frequently absent during the months leading up to his disappearance. One teacher had written in a report that Joel was often sullen, appeared injured on multiple occasions, and was afraid to speak about his home life. That same report had never been followed up. Child protection laws were far less aggressive in the 1980s, and Joel's behavior was viewed as typical teenage angst. But viewed through the lens of hindsight, the pattern suggested something far more troubling. Wanting a clearer picture, Sloan tracked down people from Joel's past. Some still lived in the same neighborhood. A former classmate, now in her 50s, remembered Joel well, especially his silence. She recalled one occasion when Joel came to school with a black eye and claimed he'd tripped in the garage. A week later, he had a fractured wrist. At the time, no one pushed for an explanation. "We didn't question those things back then," the woman told her, "but now, it doesn't sit right." Another neighbor, an elderly man who lived 2 houses down from the Beckmans, in 1989 remembered hearing a commotion the night Joel disappeared. It wasn't the normal father-son yelling match. It was something else. A crashing sound, a scream cut off abruptly, then what sounded like dragging. The next morning, the Beckman trash bins were oddly full. He remembered Walter standing in the driveway, staring blankly at the horizon, as if something inside him had shut off. The neighbor had assumed it was the stress of his son leaving, but after all these years he wondered if it had been something else. Digging deeper, Sloan ordered a forensic review of the Beckmans' property history. She found no renovation permits filed between 1989 and 1995. That wasn't unusual, but a 1993 satellite scan showed slight changes to the foundation of the home. A structural engineer, consulted by the FBI, noted that. The back of the basement appeared altered when compared to its original blueprints. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Agent Sloan also reviewed Walter's employment records. He'd been a consistent worker, never took long vacations, but he had received 2 written warnings for aggression on the job. One involved an incident where he reportedly yelled at a coworker over something trivial. Another referred to an angry outburst at a supervisor. These things were buried deep in old USPS personnel files, and none had seemed significant at the time. But when placed against the backdrop of a missing son and a history of strict authoritarian parenting, they painted a darker picture. There was no record of Joel using his Social Security number after 1989. No bank activity, no hospital admissions, no arrests, no driver's license applications. A teenager who had simply evaporated. Normally, a runaway resurfaces in some form, sometimes years later, but always leaving digital footprints behind. Joel left none. It was as if the moment he walked out of his parents' house, he stopped existing. All of this evidence pointed to one truth that no one had been willing to consider for decades. Joel had never run away. He hadn't started a new life, or joined a commune, or drifted off into the wilderness. Something had happened to him in that house, something violent, sudden, and hidden for over 30 years. And now, for the first time, someone was finally asking the right questions. The quiet calm of Oak Ridge Drive was shattered one chilly morning in March 2024, when unmarked black vehicles pulled up to the Beckman residence. Irene Beckman, now 73, had just finished her tea and was clipping coupons at the kitchen table when the knock came. The agents were polite but firm. They had a federal search warrant and needed immediate access to the property. Confused and slightly alarmed, Irene asked what this was about, but they didn't explain. Instead, one agent gently guided her to a chair while the others began inspecting the home, room by room, wall. The search focused primarily on the basement, a space Irene rarely entered anymore. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and the basement had long been Walter's domain. Organized shelves, old tools, dusty furniture, and boxes full of long-forgotten items. It was the place he went when he wanted to be alone, which was often. He would say he was fixing things or cleaning up, and Irene never questioned it. They had developed a rhythm in old age, separate but parallel lives under one roof. The agents methodically removed storage boxes, examined every inch of shelving, and took photographs of the walls. One of them ran a thermal imaging camera along the south wall and paused. A small section near the floor was registering a temperature different from the rest of the wall. It was subtle, but enough to warrant further attention. Forensic specialist tapped on the area. The sound was off, hollow. The agent nodded and demolition tools were brought in. Behind a wall of long-use unsumed shelves, stacked with expired paint cans and old tax documents, they uncovered a crudely sealed crawlspace, hidden by a layer of plywood and insulation. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough to slide through. Dust particles floated in the beam of the flashlight as the first agent crawled inside. Within minutes, the air changed. It was colder in that space, and the smell was undeniable. Something had been buried there. What the agents found inside that crawlspace would not only confirm their worst suspicions, but would upend Irene Beckman's life in a way she never imagined. Beneath a thin layer of cracked concrete, wrapped in decaying plastic and old blankets, were skeletal human remains. Dental records would later confirm what they already knew. It was Joel Beckman. His remains were mostly intact. There were no signs of post-mortem relocation, meaning he had been buried in that spot since the night he vanished. Beside him was a wooden baseball bat, the handle splintered and the barrel warped. It had once been Joel's favorite. He used to play in the yard with it as a boy, but at some point it had been repurposed into a murder weapon. Forensics would later reveal Joel had suffered massive blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Death would have been immediate. The concrete slab above him had been hastily poured, uneven and thinner than the surrounding floor. Over time, the temperature differences and settling ground had warped the area just slightly, leaving traces for those who knew where to look. But for 34 years, no one had ever looked. Outside, as the truth began to unfold, Irene sat frozen. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stared at the backyard, her eyes vacant, hands trembling. When Walter returned home later that day, he was met at the door by federal agents and immediately placed in handcuffs. He didn't resist, didn't ask why, didn't look surprised. He just lowered his head and walked calmly to the waiting vehicle. Irene stood by the screen door, watching as the man she had spent nearly 50 years beside, her husband, the father of her children, the man who had held her during countless nights of grief over their missing son, was taken away as a murderer. In the silence that followed, the truth pressed down on her chest like a weight she would never be able to lift. Upstairs, Joel's room had remained untouched all these years, a time capsule of a life stolen too soon. But down in the basement, hidden beneath a shell of suburban normalcy, was the secret Walter Beckman had buried, both literally and figuratively, the kind of truth that takes a lifetime to uncover. The arrest of Walter Beckman stunned not only Irene, but also the entire community that had once revered the couple as paragons of dignity and tradition. News of the discovery spread fast, and Oak Ridge Drive quickly transformed from a quiet residential street into a buzzing crime scene, swarmed by news vans and curious onlookers. Reporters camped outside the Beckman home for days, speaking in hushed tones about the basement body, the father's dark secret, and a mystery finally solved. To the world, it was a shocking cold case with a chilling twist. But to Irene, it was a shattering of everything she had believed about her life, her marriage, and the man she thought she knew better than anyone. In the days following Walter's arrest, Irene found herself under intense scrutiny, not just from the authorities, but from neighbors, old friends, and even extended family members. Some wondered how she could have lived in the same house for decades and not known what was buried just beneath her feet. Others defended her, insisting she had always been kind, trusting, and blind to Walter's darker tendencies. She was brought in for questioning multiple times, asked the same questions again and again. Had she heard anything that night? Had Walter ever hinted at guilt? Did she help conceal the truth? Each time her answer was the same. No, she hadn't known. Not the night Joel vanished, not the weeks after, not the years that followed. She was never charged, but the emotional toll was enough to leave her a ghost of herself. Irene began revisiting every memory from her marriage with new eyes. The quiet evenings Walter spent in the basement, the sudden insistence that Joel was just a runaway, the lack of mourning or even interest in what happened to their son. She had explained it away back then, told herself it was his way of coping, of processing grief differently, but now she knew. He hadn't been grieving, he had been hiding. In his confession, Walter didn't show remorse. He explained his actions to investigators with cold detachment, stating that he had lost control during one of their arguments. Joel had refused to follow his rules, had disrespected him repeatedly, and Walter claimed he snapped. He admitted to striking Joel with the baseball bat during a heated confrontation. Joel died instantly. In a panic, Walter hid the body in the crawlspace and returned later to cover it with concrete. He didn't cry. He didn't consider turning himself in. Instead, he crafted a simple note in Joel's handwriting — he had studied his son's penmanship from old notebooks — then placed it on the kitchen table. The next morning, he told Irene he believed Joel had run away and convinced her, over time, to stop hoping he'd return. He watched his wife suffer in silence year after year and said nothing. For 34 years, he lived a double life: devoted husband on the surface, secret killer underneath. The FBI used his confession to build a solid case, but they still pursued corroborating evidence. Investigators combed through old belongings in the basement and found the original cement bags he had used, tucked in an unused crawl space behind a false wall. There were handwritten instructions, purchase receipts dated just 2 days after Joel disappeared, and even a set of gloves with traces of dried blood and concrete dust. The case against Walter Beckman was airtight. When Walter was brought into court for his arraignment, Irene attended the hearing. She sat in the back, barely recognizable from the smiling woman in her old church photos. She watched as Walter, her husband of nearly 5 decades, entered the courtroom in shackles, his face expressionless. He didn't look at her. He never would again. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply sat there, holding the folded note Joel had supposedly written the night he vanished. Now, she knew it had never come from him. It was a lie layered over murder. A cruel forgery designed to kill not just her son, but the truth. In the months that followed, Irene withdrew from public life. She stopped attending church, stopped taking calls, stopped answering the door. Her home, once full of life and family memories, became a mausoleum of lost trust and buried secrets. The porch light remained on, not in hope, but in mourning. A final, flickering symbol for the boy who had never left home, and the mother who had never really known the man beside her. Walter Beckman's trial began in the fall of 2024, under a heavy blanket of public interest and emotional gravity. The prosecution presented the case with unwavering precision. The concealed remains of Joel Beckman, the forensic evidence linking Walter to the murder, the staged runaway note, and the damning confession he offered without hesitation. For many in the courtroom, especially those who had known the Beckmans for decades, the shock had not faded. Walter had lived among them for over 30 years with a secret that should have torn him apart, but he had gone to church, mowed his lawn, and smiled for Christmas cards like any ordinary man. That disturbing contrast became a chilling centerpiece of the trial. How someone so seemingly normal could carry out something so monstrous and live with it for the rest of his life. The defense tried to shift the narrative by portraying Walter as a man under immense pressure, claiming that Joel had become increasingly rebellious and volatile, and that the incident was never premeditated. But that argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Walter hadn't simply lost control. He had spent hours constructing a false narrative, disposing of the body, sealing it beneath concrete, and then lying for decades. That kind of deception didn't emerge from panic. It required cold calculation. The jury saw through it. After only 2 days of deliberation, Walter Beckman was found guilty of second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. At his sentencing, the judge called the act unforgivable, in both cruelty and cowardice. He was given 40 years to life, a sentence that ensured he would die in prison. Walter showed no visible emotion when the verdict was read. He neither looked to the audience nor attempted to address the court. He stared ahead, as though nothing around him mattered anymore. He was led away quietly, the door shutting behind him for the last time. For Irene, the finality of the trial did not bring the closure others assumed it would. If anything, it deepened the ache. She had spent 34 years waiting for her son to come home, clinging to some fragile strand of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was out there somewhere. That hope had helped her survive the long nights, the empty holidays, the quiet birthdays. Now she had the truth, but it was colder and heavier than anything she had ever imagined. Joel hadn't vanished. He had been trapped beneath their feet, silenced by the very man she had trusted most in the world. In the weeks after the trial, Irene began going through old boxes of Joel's things, stored away in closets and drawers she hadn't opened in decades. She found sketches he had drawn in middle school, images of trees, animals, and quiet cabins. He had dreamed of living in the woods, becoming an illustrator, building a life surrounded by nature. She found his journals, too, and read them for the first time. In the pages, Joel had written about his struggles with his father, the pressure he felt to be someone he wasn't, and his growing fear that something terrible would eventually happen if he didn't leave. He never mentioned violence directly, but the dread was there, buried between the lines. It was a quiet, aching foreshadowing of the tragedy that would follow. Irene had the basement sealed permanently. She couldn't bear to walk down there anymore, and the thought of strangers passing over the spot where her son had lain all those years was unbearable. She arranged for Joel's remains to be buried in a small cemetery outside of town, beneath the tree line where birds often nested. The headstone simply read, Joel Beckman, 1972-1989, you were loved, you are found. For the rest of her life, Irene would wrestle with a question that could never truly be answered. How had she not known? How had she shared her life with someone who carried such a brutal secret? In the end, she came to accept that Walter had been two men, one she loved and one she never met. She would never reconcile the two. The FBI closed the case, marking it solved after 34 years. Joel's file was archived, but his story would not be forgotten. Schools, families, and investigators began using the case as a cautionary example of how appearances can deceive and how important it is to ask the hard questions, even when the truth might shatter everything. And in that quiet house on Oak Ridge Drive, with its porch light still flickering each evening, Irene remained. Alone, but no longer waiting. The mystery was over. The silence had been broken. Her son, at last, had come home.